Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. We haven't done a Tabiya, an opening standard moves, in a while, so I thought we'd do one today. I thought I'd take a look at the Yugoslav Attack in the Sicilian Dragon. So I also thought I'd start at the end and work my way backward a little bit, because I wanted to show you what Stockfish would play without an opening database when we get to the main Tabiya position. And I can't let the video sit there and run, although I guess I could run and then put it on pause and then bring it back again. But I've been letting it run for the last 20 minutes already. So I just wanted to kind of capture this Stockfish analysis of the position at the start of the video, and you can go back and refer to it any time. But I think it's interesting what the computer would play without any book knowledge here. All right, let's stop the analysis and let's make the board full size. And let's go back to the start and work our way back to that position. All right, so the Sicilian is, of course, e4, c5, and there's many open Sicilians. Open Sicilians is where white plays knight f3 and d4. And there's three in the Dragon series. There's the regular Dragon, there's the accelerated Dragon, and there's the hyper-accelerated Dragon. So before we look at the regular Dragon, let's differentiate between the Dragon and the other two types. All right, the mainline Dragon goes knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. This is the famous position where if black plays a6, it's a Najdorf. If he plays knight c6, it's a classical. If he plays e6, it's a Skavenigen. If he plays g6, it's a dragon. As we pointed out in one of the earlier videos, there's a little dragon there over there. So if that's a dragon, what's an accelerated dragon? An accelerated dragon, black doesn't play d6, at least not right away. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, and now g6. So he's going to fianchetto without playing d6. And the main line here in the accelerated dragon is for white to play c4. And putting the pawns here and here in this pawn structure is called the Maraksi bind, named after Hungarian Grandmaster Geza Maraksi. And this is considered very tough for black to win against if white doesn't make any big mistakes. It's a very solid opening for white. This is one of the reasons why grandmasters don't play the accelerated dragon. Now the hyper-accelerated dragon is simply e4, c5, knight f3, g6 right away. And when white plays d4 and black plays c takes d4, white actually has the option here of playing queen takes and hitting the rook, with the idea that if black plays knight f6, you can play e5, and if black now plays knight to c6, then you move your queen, and then the black knight on f6 has to move. So this is the hyper-accelerated dragon. White could certainly just play knight takes d4, and it might transpose into a accelerated dragon. It could even transpose into a regular dragon, depending on what the two sides want to do. All right, so those are the three differences, or the differences between the three lines: the dragon, the accelerated dragon, and the regular dragon. So we're going to look at the Tabiya for the regular dragon. All right, so as we said, white plays e4, black plays c5. The idea of c5, of course, is to fight for the d4 square without having to give up a center pawn. If white wants to get space with d4, he's going to have to trade a center pawn for a side pawn. Grandmaster Bent Larsen said this was sort of the form of a positional trap, that black is good because he gets the two center pawns to white's one. Modern computers think it's not so much of a trap, that white's doing fine. And now, if black wants to play a regular dragon, he has to play d6 and delay g6 and knight c6 for later. And of course, white has lots of moves here. He can play the Moscow line, which is not an open Sicilian. But if white wants to play an open Sicilian, he usually plays d4 right away. He could also try to transpose with a move like knight c3 first. And now we have a very important principle here, which says If one side breaks with a center pawn, if you don't know what a break is, see my earlier video on break moves. If one side breaks with a center pawn, and the opposing side can take it with a side pawn, like a C or an F pawn, and the side breaking with the center pawn cannot capture back with a pawn, then it's almost always correct for the side with the side pawn to take the pawn in the center, trade the side pawn for the center pawn. So in this position, it's almost always right for black to take the pawn, which is the main line. C takes d4. So for instance, if white was instead playing a c3 Sicilian, and let's say black played the rather insipid line d6, which is a line, but I think it's like the 5th or 6th most popular, and white plays d4, now this principle does not apply. You can take the center pawn with a pawn, but white can take back with a pawn and just replace it. So here there is no principle that says whether black should take or not. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But in the main line, knight f3, d6, d4, now we've got that principle that says if one side breaks with a center pawn and the other side can take with a side pawn and the side taking recapturing cannot recapture with a pawn, it's almost always correct to do that. So here, there's no exception. C takes d4. And even though queen takes d4 is a line, it's not a dragon line. Knight takes d4. And now if black plays a move like g6, or if he plays a move like knight c6, then white can kind of punish him by playing a Maroczy bind. That's why the correct move order is for black to attack the pawn right away to force white to put the knight in front of the c-pawn. Yes, white has other ways of guarding the pawn, but they're not any better than playing knight c3 anyway. So the main line here is knight c3, and now that the knight is in front of the c-pawn, there cannot be a Maroczy bind, and that makes black very happy. And as we said before, if black wants to play a dragon here, he would play g6. If he plays like knight c6, we've got maybe a Richter-Reuser, or a Sozin, or maybe a Boleslavsky in the classical Sicilian. So it's got to be g6. A lot of times when your opponents play different move orders, you can take advantage of them. If he says, well, I wanted to play a dragon, but I wanted to play knight c6 first, well, that just won't work if you're playing it right. So what should white do now? Well, white has lots of ways of playing against the dragon. He can play the classical line where he just plays the very straightforward bishop e2, bishop e3, castle kingside. And then he has to watch out for black getting in an early d5. So he's going to probably play something like knight to b3. But that's a little bit outside the scope of today's video. We're not going over all the lines against the dragon. We're not looking at, for instance, the Levenfish line with f4. We're just looking at the Yugoslav. So in the Yugoslav line, white plays f3 and bishop e3. Now when you're playing an English attack, you can sort of do it either way. Here white usually plays bishop e3 first. And this is a little bit of an exception to the principle that says don't put your bishop on e3 if he can just be harassed by knight to g4. Because here knight to g4 actually loses. Suppose black wants to punish bishop e3 and he plays knight to g4. See if you can figure out why white is winning here. The answer is that white can play bishop to b5 check. Bishop to b5 check is a strong move because if black plays bishop to d7, that bishop is not really guarding the knight on g4 anymore, and the bishop on b5 is guarded, and white can just play queen takes g4, thanks for the piece. Sneaky pin. A sneaky pin, as Charles Hertan says, is when you're taking off a piece that's not really guarded by a pinned piece. And here the bishop on d7 is pinned, so it's not really guarding that knight. But if he plays knight d7, that blocks the bishop from guarding the knight, and queen takes g4 is possible. And if knight c6, white has too many pieces on that square, and white can just start taking on c6, and black can't play knight takes e3 because knight takes d8 is check, and black doesn't have time to take the queen. So it's all bad. So knight to g4 is not possible here. It loses to bishop to b5 check. So that means bishop e3 is perfectly okay. And now black plays bishop to g7. Now knight to g4 is sort of a threat. So for instance, I've seen people here misguidedly play queen to d2 first. Queen to d2 is an inaccuracy because black can play knight to g4. And now if white plays bishop to b5 check, if black plays bishop d7, the knight is not hanging. And even so, black could actually just play king to f8 here and say, where are you going with this bishop? Because this bishop is really important on e3. He's guarding this all-important d4 square that the fianchettoed bishop is attacking and the knight on c6 is going to attack. And if black can get the bishop pair by eliminating that bishop, it'll be a major strategic positional bonus for black to do that. And here it's really hard for instance, if white plays bishop f4, then e5 forks the knight and the bishop. If he plays bishop g5, black can start attacking the bishop this way with h6. And again, this isn't all that wonderful for white. So knight to g4 is a threat. Once black plays bishop g7 and clears out the f8 square for the king, if white wants to go into the mainline Yugoslav, he can't do it with queen to d2. He has to play f3. And the idea of f3 is very simple. As my late friend Ken Bohm told me many, many years ago when he was a much better player than I was, he said, Dan, you just play your pawn to f3, you put your queen on d2, you castle queenside, you throw your kingside pawns at him, and you go after checkmate on the king side. And it's kind of funny because a couple years later, Bobby Fischer came out with his book, My 60 Memorable Games, and he gave a game where he played Larson, and he basically said the same thing that my friend did. He said, oh, I know how to play against this. You play f3, castle queenside, push up your pawns, sack, 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 mate. A little oversimplistic, but they have the right idea. All right, so f3 here. The idea is twofold. One, well, actually, it's threefold. One is to guard the e-pawn so the knight can move. Two is to stop the knight going to g4. And three is to support the pawns coming up with h4 and g4 after you castle queenside and you storm black. Okay, and in the main line of the dragon here, black has a choice between castles and knight c6. Usually he castles. And then white plays queen to d2. And black plays knight to c6. Notice this has all the trademarks of a good opening for both sides. One of the things we're looking for is move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. And here, the only piece that's moved twice is the knight, but the knight had to recapture on d4. And of course, when you make a recapture, it's a form of a tactic. It's preventing your opponent from winning material if you don't recapture. So it's a defensive tactic. So recapturing with knight takes d4 does not violate any principles. And notice everybody has moved every piece once here. So this is the standard position. And when I was learning to play chess, and my friend taught me this position, and I would play it in tournaments, there was only two moves that were considered here. The main line was bishop to c4, and the other line, considered the lesser line, was castle queenside. And I used to play against castle queenside. I used to play knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop e6, and then play like queen a5 and attack that way. But the modern way of playing against castle queenside is to play the break move d5 and to resolve the center with some very complex play. The main line in the old days was bishop to c4. And this was played in most of the games, and there was many books written about this position, and there's many ways for black to play it against it, and we'll look at one in a minute. But as we saw at the start of the video, if I can bring that analysis back up, I turned off the engine. But here at 35 ply, Stockfish says the right move is neither of those moves. It says the number one move is to play g4 right away, just as if it's an English attack. An English attack is a very common way of playing this kind of structure for white with an early g4, but it's usually played against the Nahdorf and openings like that, and not against the mainline dragon. But the engines have said that g4 here is pretty good. In fact, if you look at the number, it's 0.98. 0.98, well, that's almost winning. 1.0 or greater could be winning. And the computer says in this book line that already at 35 ply, white has a 0.98 advantage. It's no wonder that you don't see the dragon at top-level grandmaster play. And this is the reason that The dragon was always known to be very complex and subject to computer analysis, but now the computers are saying that white's advantage is almost winning out of the opening. And if that's true, nobody's going to want to give away an almost entire pawn advantage to someone booked up with all this computer analysis. So g4 is a modern move. It's a very strong move in this position. And it's become a main line, obviously. All right, so let's take a look at bishop to c4. There's many, many lines for black against bishop to c4. Let's widen the board again to get rid of the analysis. The main move against bishop to c4, but not the only move, is bishop to d7. Black could play a6, which used to be considered a waste of time, but it's now considered like a Dragdorf. Half dragon, half Nadorf, a Dragdorf. So black's got other moves. He's got some mysterious moves like, rook to b8, threatening to play b5 and sack a pawn to open up the line of white castle's queenside. But the main line is bishop to d7. And now white has a choice between h4 and castle queenside. A lot of times he castles queenside. Black plays rook c8, threatening a discovery on this bishop on c4. So the bishop has to go back to b3. And now black plays something like knight e5, threatening to win the bishop pair with knight to c4. In this position, this well-known position, when I first started playing, the main line was to play h4. And then black would play something like knight to c4, bishop takes, rook takes. And now white would play either king to b1 or h5 and sack a pawn with a complicated line. Later on, Karpov, after king b1, I think played something like knight on 4 to e2 and then pushed the pawn. But American Grandmaster Andy Soltis came up with what the computer today would say would be the best move and has considered to be the best line, and that is to stop h5 completely by simply black playing h5 by himself. And the Soltis variation, has become so popular that an entire book was written just on the Soltis variation. So I have a trivia question. When Frank Marshall discovered the Marshall Attack, I'll just show you that real quickly, in the Ruy Lopez, he was analyzing at home, and he decided that in the mainland, this goes back to our earlier video on the Tabiya of the Ruy Lopez, he discovered if white plays c3, that black can play d5 and offer the e5 pawn as compensation. And now the main line today is to play c6 and bishop d6. Marshall, I think, was aware of that idea, but he thought maybe another idea of playing knight f6 first, before he played bishop d6, was okay also. So he wanted to play this against somebody really good because he thought it would be a wonderful way to spring an attack. And he didn't want to waste it on any of the minor American masters or some of the other lower players he played. So he waited about 10 years to 1918 to play this. And he wanted to play it against someone who deserved to be played against. And he waited till he got paired with the great Capablanca. And he played it against Capablanca. And Capablanca had never seen this before, and he considered it a great challenge. And Capablanca played a wonderful line and managed to beat Marshall. Now, of course, Capablanca was a much better player than Marshall, but Marshall wanted to wait and spring this against somebody really good. So my question is, when Andy Soltis came up with his idea of playing, we don't want to play another Ruy Lopez, we want to play a dragon this time. Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, castles, queen d2, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop d7. It's always a good idea to go over these tabiyas again and again. Castle queenside, rook c8, bishop b3, knight e5, h4, h5. So the question is, who did Andy save to play this against? Here he was 50 years after Marshall, and he had a chance to spring it too. So He could have waited to play against America's #1 player, Bobby Fischer. He could have waited to play against the world champion, Boris Spassky. He could have waited to play against the former world champion, Petrosian. He could have waited to play against the U.S. #2 player, Sammy Reshevsky. So the question is, who did Andy wait and play this against? Who was the first person who played white in a tournament game against Andy Soltis? Now, Andy wasn't quite a GM when he first played this. He was just about to become a GM. Who was that mysterious white player? Well, some of you might know the answer. The answer is some guy named Dan Heisman at the Continental Intercollegiate in 1969, I think. So yes, I won my first round in that tournament, and in the second round I got paired on board 1 against the top-rated player in the tournament, Andy Soltis. And this is how our game started. And this was Andy told me this is the first time he ever played H5 in a tournament game. So the answer to the trivia question is, it was me that he played it against. So that's that's one of my rare claims to fame in over-the-board play, is and every time people mention my name to Andy, he goes, oh yeah, he's the guy who I first played my line against in the Dragon. And I actually got a pretty decent game, considering Andy had analyzed this and I hadn't. And I had a better end game, and then I blundered, and I actually blundered, and I miscalculated. I got tired, and I had a rook. I think I had a rook and a pawn against a knight and 3 pawns, and I had an easy draw, and I hallucinated and miscalculated and allowed Andy to push a pawn, and all of a sudden I couldn't stop the pawn, and I lost. So, and after the game, everybody came running over and said, "You had the #1 player. You had a draw in the end game. How could you throw it away? You messed us all up because you could have knocked him out of first place." And I said to them, "Believe me, I feel worse than you do." Anyway, so I managed to lose the game even though I had a draw in the end game and I blundered. So I thought that's a good trivia question. Is who was the first one to play that in? Okay, so Sicilian Dragon. So just as a review again, e4, c5, knight f3. If black plays knight... By the way, if black plays knight c6, you can't just do the same stuff. If white tries to play this bishop e3, knight f3, f3 stuff, it doesn't work without the pawn on d6. Black has a chance here to play like queen to b6 in some of these lines, or even play e6 and d5, or even play queen b6 instead of castles. And this is complicated stuff, but this is not at all the way you're supposed to play against the accelerated. I actually played the accelerated dragon myself for a while, and people would play this against me all the time, and I'd be like, oh good, it's very complicated, but it's perfectly okay for black. And they don't understand they're not playing against the regular dragon, they're playing against the accelerated dragon. You don't play f3 against the accelerated dragon. But people would do it anyway. And in fact, I think when some of the grandmasters wrote a book about this, some of the British grandmasters, I think they called this like the weekend variation, because the weekend players, who were the grade players, would play this kind of line against the accelerated dragon. All right, so you don't want to play as if you're playing against the dragon. You don't want to play a Yugoslav kind of attack. The only time you play the Yugoslav attack is if they're actually playing the regular dragon with the pawn on d6. And now you can do this stuff. Bishop e3, bishop g7, f3 to stop knight g4, castle, queen d2, knight c6. And here's where you have the big choice. Castle was very, very popular, 15 years ago when the computers were starting to get good. Bishop c4 has always been the #1 move, and now the computers are saying, hey, maybe even better is to get the pawns rolling right away with g4. Notice how that plays against the Soltis variation a little bit by immediately putting, a pawn to attack that h5 square. Not that black can't play h5 against this kind of play anyway, but that's outside the scope of our video. Okay, so this was our Tabiya for the Yugoslav variation of the Sicilian Dragon. There's millions of lines here. They're very complicated. They write entire books of these lines. I couldn't nearly possibly do any justice on going much further than I did today in a basic video explaining the basic moves. But if you want to play the dragon for white or black, my suggestion is, you need to pick up a good book on it and and learn some of the lines. You can't kind of wing the dragon for either white or black. It's very, very easy to get destroyed when you play these really complicated lines where your opponent knows what they're doing and you don't. So that would be my advice is, learn it a little bit before you try to play it for either side. All right, for our YouTube series, this is Dan Heisman. I hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.